All right.
So turn it back now.
So I'm hoping that everyone can hear me online here because I'm green. Awesome. Hello, people in the room and people online. Thank you for coming to SAgE seminar series and those that have been previously and ongoing. Today I'm Kirsty, I'll be chairing the session for today. And today we've got Bryan Boruff and Dan Dixon with us. They'll both do their presentations and then we'll take all questions at the end. I'll be on my computer to go through any of the questions online as well. But anybody online, when we get to question time, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question as well. We're in the Ag Lecture Theatre, so hopefully small enough that most people can hear what's being said. If you're online and having trouble hearing us, just put a comment in the chat and I'll fix it. So first off, we'll start with Bryan, Environmental Geographer with the UWA School of Agriculture and Environment.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I guess, where to start? One thing that I will start with is we have titled this Spatial Approaches to Natural Disasters, and I am going to caveat this, that if you are a hardcore hazards or climate person, that really we've moved on from that term natural disasters. So I just want to say we recognize that they're complex disasters now. They're not natural anymore. No disaster is natural because it includes humans. Anyway, I think the other thing we want to emphasize here is that we're also going to talk about remote sensing, and I'm going to take a very broad definition to remote sensing and even maybe remove the word remote and talk about sensing and where sensing sort of fits into all of this. But I also want to acknowledge that I'm really here filling in for Natasha Pauly, a colleague of ours who's unwell. And so really this is a lot of her work, although I've been involved in it, but this is some work that she has led that I'm going to be talking about. The other thing I want to say is that the work that and the funding that has supported this work has come from a variety of sources, WUN and Asia Pacific Network, and is a consortium of a number of universities, including University of Sydney, Auckland, us, South Pacific, and also the Royal University of Phnom Penh that's not on here, which should be.
It's slow, this computer.
There we go. The one thing I wanted to do, though, to kind of start off is to give us a little bit of framing, because that I think in the description of today's talk, it was the notions of climate change and adaptation and hazards were all sort of in the description and in the title. But also that notion of remote sensing. And so Dan's going to, and I'll point out where Dan's going to talk about a remote sensing, but I guess I wanted to talk about where we use remote sensing well in this framing, but where we don't use remote sensing well, and that's kind of what I'll talk about, is how we sort of augment remotely sensed data in understanding climate change adaptation and hazards and the spatial dimensions of hazards. So if we look on this diagram, we do and this is from the IPCC, we do a pretty good job of understanding sort of the drivers of climate and monitoring and measuring those drivers using remote sensing technology and sensing technologies. We do a pretty good job of being able to sort of spatially delineate and kind of understand the impacts of hazard events and disaster events. What we don't necessarily do a very good job of, and is really hard to do with remotely sensed data, is understand vulnerability and also understand these notions of adaptation and how we adapt to changing climate and to climate-related hazards and disasters. So we do a good job sort of in this portion of the diagram here, but we don't do as good of a job over here in this portion of the diagram. So there are some ways that we can go about augmenting. So I wanted to sort of hit on two areas in this context, and one is linking on the ground traditional knowledge with scientific measurements, and this notion of data imputation, which is kind of where we're seeing a lot of trends at the moment in remote sensing. And I'm going to talk about these in the context of Cambodia in the first instance, and we'll see how I go time-wise, and I might talk about Fiji if I can. But what I'm going to talk about is going to come from these publications and master's thesis. But this is a paper that Natasha has led and was just recently published. She was also editor of this book, Climate-Induced Disasters in Asia Pacific Region, which is a compendium of chapters around the work that we've been doing over the years in Fiji and a couple of other locations in the Pacific, and also really Cambodia in Asia. And so there are a number of book chapters from master's and honor students that we've co-supervised in there, and then a recent master's student that has done some work on flood mapping in the 𝒂𝒏 catchment in Fiji. So I want to orientate you geographically, and so first off, we're going to talk about Cambodia in a region up near Kretchi. So this is along the Mekong River. These are, so this is about a 4-hour drive up the Mekong outside of Phnom Penh. And these are where we've spent some time, 4 or 5 communities along the Mekong. These are agrarian communities, and agrarian communities that live with the flood cycle of the Mekong. So what happens every year is that these, and here's an example of domicile or residence along in these villages. As I said, they live with the flood cycle, and you can see what the homes are on stilts. And so every year, this portion of the Mekong floods and maintains flood water for several months. And so the community members take really annual precautions to deal with flooding, but it is the lifeblood of their livelihoods as well. So they have coping mechanisms, one of which is by building homes on stilts. The other is moving any of their assets during those flood periods. The crops that are generally grown in the region, we were just talking about this, the first image that you saw was tobacco, corn or maize, and both dry and wet rice, as well as some fruit crops as well, and nut crops are starting to be grown. Not as much livestock, but that augments livelihoods a bit. Interestingly, there's quite a bit of movement. So these communities are on one side of the Mekong, but sort of the main road, and Kretchi, the main town in the region, is on the other side of the Mekong. So ferry services back and forth are continually running. So think about climate change and climate change in these locations. What we're seeing, and I was giving a talk recently at a COP workshop, we were talking about how we get people to understand climate change and the impacts of climate change, particularly people that are not experiencing them. And I made this comment that in sort of temperate urban centers, the really feeling climate change is maybe some increase in prices in our food and fuel stuffs, and maybe a few extra hot days, and maybe a little less rain. But for a lot of people that are not living in these types of locations, climate change is something that they're feeling and that is impacting livelihoods. And having a better understanding of that is really important. So I think we understand that really through spending time on the ground, is that these are some of the things that locals are noting in terms of changes in the environment, and they are really attuned to these changes, and those changes help drive their decision making around livelihoods, particularly around agriculture. So they've noted that we're seeing increased temperature, we're seeing decreased rainfall, and we're seeing changes in the flooding regime of the Mekong River. And potentially stronger winds and more lightning. Okay, so these are things that people on the ground are saying, but we can then start to think about, well, we can relate that back to what the scientific record is saying and what sensed measurements are saying. Okay, and that's really where remote sensing and sensing in general comes in, is being able to relate and verify what people are saying they're seeing on the ground and what actually is being measured. So this comes from, I'll show a number of graphics from this paper, but this is based on flood gauge measurements along the Mekong in 𝒂𝒐 area. And so what this is showing us is that, well, we're starting to see variability in flood levels, and the actual measured record is showing us this, right? So it's not just what people are saying on the ground, we can actually relate this back to what the flood gauges are saying. And variability in timing of the flood. So we're starting to see a shift as well as one or more peaks in the flood regime. So 2011 and 2018 were extremely high floods. So again, more variability in the extremes of those flood events. And as I said, as I identified this, we often see two peaks, or if we don't see two peaks, then we're seeing variability in that. And so that influences how people start to think about and interact and make decisions around the environment, such as sowing of crops. So it's easy to, or what we can get from sort of the scientific realm is those quantitative and biophysical data, such as stream gauge information. So we can start to look at interannual rainfall and variability, monthly rainfall variability, and things to that extent. We can figure out different ways to sort of measure and understand those patterns and those trends. What that allows us to do is standardize these measurements, understand these trends, but augment that local information, augment and aid local interpretations of what is actually going on. Okay, so it's moving from that notion of anecdotal evidence to hard measurements that are showing those trends occurring on the ground. And then we can also use that information to begin to train local models in terms of what's happening. But how do we go from that sort of measurement, those scientific measurements, if you will, to linking that with local data? And so then we have to start to think about, well, what are some of those approaches to understanding and collecting information on the ground and relating that then to local data? And what 𝒂𝒊𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂, who I believe is on screen, spent a lot of time working with locals and developing crop calendars and sort of livelihood calendars as to how they're using the environment at what times of the year, and then looking at, well, how does that then relate to what we're seeing in the environment from these scientific measures? So coming back to that notion of sensing and remote sensing and scientific measurement in general, we do a pretty good job in sort of this area in noting and monitoring those environmental changes. We do an okay job in verifying perceived drivers of these environmental changes, whether it's deforestation, so we can map deforestation using remotely sensed imagery. We can examine flood and monitor flood flows and flood regimes. And well, global change, that's a little bit trickier, but we can do a pretty good job in that measurement and monitoring space through here. But actually, when it comes down to what's happening on the ground, it becomes much more difficult. And we have to look to those alternative methods and actually get out and talk to people and interact with people and verify and quantify what's happening on the ground so that we can link it with what's happening. So just to give you an overview of all the different data collection techniques that have occurred over time in these locations, a lot of participatory mapping. Now that combines satellite imagery and remote sensing data with people's understanding of processes as they occur on the landscape. So a lot of time sitting with people and looking at imagery and talking about, where livelihood activities are occurring and how people are using the environment, and how their uses of those environments have changed over time, and how uses of the environment change on an annual basis, and how they change when different types of shocks to the environment are occurring, whether it's changes in the flood regime, increased drought type activities, or forest fires, something to that effect. Okay, so a lot of time, talking to people and understanding what's going on. Informal conversations, getting out there and walking, talking to people, interviews, discussions with community leaders, and this is something that 𝒂𝒐𝒊𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 spent quite a bit of time on, is developing seasonal crop calendars. So again, coming back to understanding when people are doing certain activities throughout the year. Now, what we've done then is related that to remotely based imagery, if you will, in terms of being able to map and monitor flood regimes along the Mekong, and then also being able to understand rainfall patterns using gauge data as well. So this is a series of images that were collected and analyzed through this region that we've been talking about. Now, this is using Sentinel-1A data, and this is synthetic aperture radar. Now, the reason why we're using synthetic aperture radar here is that one of the issues that we have, and this comes back to why we can't always use remotely sensed imagery and other scientific measurements to correspond with what's going on the ground, is that we have big issues with cloud cover. So this region of the world, a lot of cloud cover, and so optical remote sensing imagery, which would be the sort of go-to imagery, is the ground is obstructed from view. The other issue that we have is that we would discuss as temporal resolution, so the repeat time of satellites imaging these locations. And so when you combine limited repeat times of appropriate resolution imagery with cloud cover that obscures our ability to sense and examine what's happening on the ground, we have to look for alternative methods. So one of the approaches that is more commonly being used is using synthetic aperture radar, and that allows us to penetrate through cloud cover and examine what's going on the ground. However, there are different techniques to analyzing this than we would use with historic optical imagery. So what's happening here is a way of classifying if a pixel is flooded or not flooded. And that's based on examining backscatter. So how much really additional information is coming back to the satellite as it sends some information down and reflects off the surface of the Earth, bounces off the surface of the Earth. So by thresholding that value of backscatter, we can identify if a pixel is flooded or not flooded. So this is great, because then we can start to identify and to corroborate, if you will, what locals are saying on the ground in terms of when locations are flooded or a specific pixel is flooded, and the timing of that flooding. And also the timing of the flooding and how that progresses throughout the season. So you're seeing the top two images are over a period of time. So that really that flooding season, how many days a specific pixel was flooded. So that starts to give us an understanding of the length of time that particular location is in flood. And then what we're seeing here is on the bottom two images is the first day of the flood season that it was identified that that pixel was flooded, so that we can start to see the pattern of across the landscape of what is flooded and how that flood progresses. So that's really what that's telling us, and we can do this with synthetic aperture radar, if you will. We can identify how long a pixel is flooded over a period of time, and we can identify when that first date of flooding. And that's great and all, but that doesn't necessarily give us an indication of how that flooding actually progresses throughout the season. And flood modeling doesn't necessarily do this either, because there's a lot of nuance that happens on the ground that if we're not there talking to people to understand what's happening, we won't get the picture of what's going on. And so what actually happens in 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂, the flow of the Mekong is from upstream to downstream, but interestingly, the flooding comes from the eastern portions of the island because these are lower lying, and then we begin to flood, the western portion of the island, and then we begin to flood eastward. Okay, but you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you talk to people on the ground. And the two communities here, 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂, Hulong, and 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂, we have our communities along here actually living along the levee system, if you will. We have higher ground further inland and sort of swampy land between the levee system and the higher ground. And this is where all the agriculture takes place. But what generally happens is there are outlets through the levee, and so the water comes through these outlets and begins to fill and fill this back lake area, if you will. And once that fills, then it comes back forward and tops the levees. And that's with the seasonal flood event. And then when we have a flash flood event, that water is coming from the highlands, thought to be because of deforestation, and comes rushing down and fills the back area, which then comes and tops the levee. So without actually getting there and talking to people and understanding what actually is happening with floodwater, it's harder to link those adaptation strategies to what actually is going on the ground. So another way that we've sort of parsed and looked at this, and this is back to rainfall, and one of the things that they've been noticing is the shortening of the monsoon season. And this is the standard deviation of monsoon days, that there's also increased variability in what that monsoon period is. And this diagram here is sort of, this is I guess we call it a heat map, or just called a heat map of monthly rainfall. And you can see that sort of in the first 2 decades of analysis that we're doing, the 1980s through to 2000, you really see that a nice linear trend there in terms of the start and the finish of the monsoon season. But as we start to get out to more contemporary years, we start to lose that nice signal, and we start to see increased variability. Now that has implications then for how farmers make decisions around sowing, harvesting, crop choice, and the number of crops that they can get into the ground in a particular year. So this is where linking that scientific measurement of rainfall through to qualitative understandings of crop calendars and day-to-day livelihoods throughout a season can begin to understand, well, what the implications are for these changes in climate and what the adaptation measurement or what the adaptation approaches are. And just as an example, in terms of rice planting, So what often occurs is two crops of rice, a wet crop and a dry crop. Wet using the flooded area and the flooded regime of the Mekong to sow directly after the flooding or during and into the post-flooding seasonal flood period of the Mekong. But when there's seasonal variability and we have decrease in rainfall or in flooding during that period, then they might decide not to sow a wet rice crop. However, so then what do? Well, then you fall back on a dry rice crop. But as I showed you in that previous example, the previous rainfall heat map, that there's increased variability in the start and the end of the monsoon season. So that influences and can impact when you sow your dry rice. So if you put your dry rice in the ground and all of a sudden you have a flooding event and your seed's gone, then you're in trouble. The other thing I wanted to point to, so that's some ideas around linking scientific measurements and remote sensing and sensing in general to what's going on the ground. The other thing that this paper discusses, which I think is really a way forward, and we might see more of, and I think potential areas for further exploration, particularly in linking remotely sensed imagery and remotely sensed data to some of the perceived environmental changes. So observation, so these are traditional ways of predicting flooding along the Mekong, are around looking at the clarity of the water and the speed of water flows and even the sound of the water. And I think where there's some room for further exploration is how we link what people are seeing and use to predict flooding in terms of clarity in particular and speed back to what the sensors are seeing. And particularly around clarity, and who knows, maybe we start to think about ways to relate sound as well to remotely sensed sound sensors. So anyway, that was just some observations. Well, I'll be really quick. So that's Cambodia. Then we've also been working in Fiji and in the 𝒂𝒂𝒏 catchment, and both these regions are locations that are impacted by changing and flooding and flood regimes and flood hazards. And so in the 𝒂𝒏 province, so that in 𝒂𝒐𝒏, it's around changes in those seasonal patterns and climate-induced changes in those seasonal patterns. In 𝒂𝒏, it's increased flash flood events, and those tend to be tied to cyclones and increased cyclone activity. And so one of the things that we've looked at is how we identify and map flood events in this location, really across the South Pacific. Because the way damage assessments are done currently is we've got to get people out into the field, on the ground, identifying what's happening, and they can't always get there. And when you're dealing with a lot of small islands, transport and moving around and getting out and surveying all the locations that have particularly been impacted by flooding is quite difficult, takes quite a bit of time. So we've been playing around with how you actually, approaches that we can use to map sort of smallholder agricultural crop impact throughout the South Pacific, but with a focus on 𝒂𝒏. I'm sort of going through those aims and objectives. But this is another sort of, I guess, trend, if you will, in that remote sensing space tied to climate change and hazards. And that is really bringing together multiple data sources And I talk about this from the notion of imputing. So imputing areas where we have holes in information with other data sets, whether that's spatial imputation or temporal imputation. Temporal imputation may be, or well, spatial imputation may be filling gaps in our data with other data sets. Temporal imputation may be looking at the same data set, but 2 time points before I have a hole in my data and after I have a hole in my data. So this is some work that Rocio is doing, mapping flood impact on a pixel level in the 𝒂𝒏 catchment, but looking at bringing together multiple data sources, Planet Lab, Sentinel-2, Sentinel-1, as well as in situ data and some other ancillary measures, such as distance to river. Pulling together all that information and throwing that into, in this instance, a random forest classifier to train the pixels, able to train pixels to identify if a pixel was flooded or not flooded. And so she was able to do this with around 76% accuracy, here using social media to validate whether a pixel was flooded or not. But what we're looking at here are all the dark blue pixels. So those were pixels that could be identified as flooded after an event using the data that was available. All of the light blue pixels were gaps in the data that we were able to use alternative sources and machine learning algorithm to predict if that pixel would have been flooded or not. And like I said, she was able to do that with about 76% accuracy. So just sort of some comments around what I've been talking about. There's often places around the world that are data poor, and they're data poor for a range of different reasons. It may be that there's just sensors aren't there, this data's not being collected, or we have issues with climatic and meteorological conditions that don't allow information to be collected, such as cloud cover. And so we have incomplete information in those locations, but we can link those with traditional knowledge and knowledge on the ground. And by doing so, that takes a knowledge poor or data poor location, links it with knowledge richness, and gives us a better picture of what's actually going on the ground. And by doing that, by actually getting out there and talking to people and showing them what's happening in terms of the scientific record and linking that with what they're seeing and perceiving is going on in the environment, then we enhance that sort of co-learning space. We're learning from each other. We're learning from them what's actually happening and how those patterns transpire. They're learning from us what's happening and what's being measured in the scientific record. And by pulling those two together, we build consensus that these things are actually occurring. It's not anecdotal anymore. And when we can build consensus, then we can start to look and think about management strategies. And those management strategies can be co-developed and appropriate for the specific location. And if they're co-developed, then it increases our likelihood that they're actually going to be used and taken up. And that now really with cloud-based computing and our ability to really access and use and interact with a multitude of data sources over spatial extents and extended time periods, we have been and can start to do more imputation with our data to fill in those data gaps to get a complete picture of what's going on the ground. So I'll stop right there. I'm going to hand over to Dan. And so Dan's going to talk about, well, he can tell you what he's going to talk about, but in fitting with sort of this theme around hazards and climate change, Dan's going to talk about that sort of monitoring space, monitoring impacts on climate and those drivers of climate, and also how we sort of analyze and examine and monitor the recovery period all around flowering in Southwest WA.
Thanks for that transition, Brian. Again, I'm Dan Dixon. I'm a PhD student in geography here, and this section of my talk is titled Mapping Forest Disturbance, Reproduction and Disturbance in Southwest WA. This research is funded through the CRC for honeybee products, I should say. And I'll go ahead and get going. Really two sections of the talk. First, I'll be going over the talk is split up into two independent studies that we've done. And the first is developing the system to monitor flowering eucalypts in the Southwest, mainly looking at Mary and some Jarrah. And with that model, we're using drone and CubeSat imagery. So this is a little bit more of a remote sensing based talk. So the drone data we went out and collected, and I'll go over a little bit of some of the data that we gathered. And then with CubeSat data, this is a kind of a new data set that's really only been available for the past 5-6 years. This is referring to a constellation of small satellites. And with this constellation, the private company Planet provides daily or near daily satellite imagery globally. And we resample that to 6x6 meter resolution. And for each 6x6 meter pixel that we are observing this time series on, we can provide this flowering prediction for that tree canopy. And then next, looking at our disturbance, really fire severity in the Southwest. So using airborne imagery and Landsat data to kind of create a catalog of fire severity over the past 16 years. And here we're not saying whether or not something was burned, but we're predicting the severity of that fire, which we define as the impact of fires, the impact of fire on the forest canopy. So that in this case is really a % canopy scorch scoring. And we provide that within each fire that's happened in the Northern Jarrah Forest. So I'll go into each one of those independently, and then somewhere in the middle, it should be pretty clear how we plan on merging them currently. So for my PhD, this is essentially what we're trying to do is understand these drivers of eucalypt flowering. And flowering is not just a measure of a bioindicator of forest health and regeneration, but it also provides resources for biodiversity in the form of pollen and nectar for birds, insects, mammals, species that are endemic to the Southwest. So really these drivers are probably interacting between each other. And what we see from the observations and talking with folks on the ground is these different species flower. Some flower every year, others flower every 8 to 12 years. There's quite a bit of variability from one species to the next and across years and across regions. So really trying to understand some of these, some of the data that we have. And so this is an example of the canopy that we're trying to describe with remote sensing. So this is taken from a drone outback of Mundaring. And this is our species of interest, is 𝒂𝒏 𝒂𝒂𝒊𝒂𝒓, the keystone species and eucalypt species in the Southwest, one of the defining species in the Jarrah Forest. And really you see that this is actually a combination of Jarrah and Mary flowering. So these are both Mary, and then here's some Jarrah, which is slightly different color flowers and different shape flowers. But from our exercise, we're really just doing flowering, not flowering, and looking at the time when Mary flowers, and assuming that if we see this during this time, then this is this species. So some trees flower every other year. Some trees never flower, and maybe they flower at different times of the year. So we can't really go out there with static drone images and say yes or no. This was the flowering dynamics of this site on this year. We really need to use the drone data to then build up to the satellite, which we have observations daily or near daily with near daily frequency. So back in 2019 and 2020, we kind of built this fieldwork plan to go out and really monitor flowering across quite a few forest blocks in the Southwest. So quite a few of these, I think there's like 10 or 11 different sites, and a few of them, we've revisited 2-3 times, and that was before, during, and after flowering. And just from Dan Dixon, Junk Forest, and Mundaring, just a few of the shots that we took from a pretty fancy drone that lets us collect pretty large data sets, about 25 hectare data sets with 2 centimeter resolution. And so from that, we're building up to satellite data. And this method that I'm talking about now, we just published in the journal Remote Sensing of Environment just earlier this year. And it's really one of the first remote sensing applications of forest flowering, especially with time series data. So say we have our flowering tree time series on the x-axis. We bring in the PlanetScope time series, which we're computing 2 vegetation indices to kind of characterize what we see for each pixel. So we have a greenness index and a brightness index. And as you'd expect, when that tree is flowering, we see a decrease in greenness because it's covered in these bright cream-colored flowers. And then we also see this albedo spike, or what we're calling a brightness index, to characterize the overall quantity of flowers within that pixel. And then based on our drone surveys, we can say on that day, for that pixel, there was 30% flowering going on. And then we repeat that observation across multiple sites, across multiple dates, and feed that into a machine learning algorithm, and to then provide this flowering prediction over time. We really trained and tested on independent dates in the time series, and then apply it to all days in the time series. And we do this with the help of Google Earth Engine, which is a cloud computing environment that really lets us do everything in a one-stop shop for masking clouds, resampling our data, and extracting all of these time series predictors, training the model, and then predicting with the model. And here's one of the figures from the paper. So on top is a drone image that we collected in Dan Dixon, about 2 hours north of Perth. And we zoom into 2 satellite pixel time series, A1 and A2. And so for pixel A1, we kind of follow that. In this case, we have a GNDVI, which is our greenness index, and the EBI, which is our brightness index. And we follow that time series through time, and we see this drop in greenness and a spike in at our EBI value. And then we can say that on this day, March 13, we were there, we saw that pixel flowering with our drone. And the inverse for our non-flowering pixel. Maybe we're predicting a small amount of flowering earlier in the season in January, but quite a significant difference in the prediction time series. So with that, we're getting about 4% error, and the maximum amount of flowering we see for any pixel is about 30%, 20 to 30%. So pretty reasonable amount of error considering what we're trying to predict. And we're not really trying to have this super quantitative score for magnitude prediction within each pixel, but really to characterize flowering on the landscape. And so this is a little visualization that I made to actually see what's going on. And this is at a different site within the Northern Jarrah Forest in Mundaring, about an hour east of Perth. And you see that there's really no flowering going on. On the x-axis is time from January 1st to March 10, and then the y-axis is the number of predicted flowering pixels. We see that this flowering event really happens over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, between when we would expect, because we were here and we have drone data to kind of validate what the model is predicting. And it's really isolated in this kind of riparian corridor, which is also, we're asking some more questions about topography and access to soil moisture and when and where flowering happens. So we have this, and because we're using Earth Engine, we can scale this to a pretty large area, several hundred, thousands of forest blocks in the Jarrah forest. So this is one of the observations that I've seen just looking at the data. So this is just a patch of bush next to Mundaring Weir, and you can see that there's a bit of forest flowering right along the water there, and our model is predicting these trees flowered on this day in 2018, and then, but really nothing towards the western half. And then we can kind of go back in time and kind of just see what happened there. And just 6 months before this was a prescribed burn that a controlled fuel reduction burn that went through this patch of forest. And a fire is not a yes/no event. It's continuous, and impact to forest canopy is continuous. In that we see that those trees that did flower just along the water, they were what you'd call a low severity or mid severity burn, or potentially unburned. And so just making observations like this kind of set out to characterize what we're seeing really for fire severity now, to be able to ask these questions about impacts of fire on flowering. And so I've gone a little bit backwards. I've talked about regeneration before disturbance, but that's the order that we did the work. So now building this fire severity model to then merge everything together. So really not just time since fire. So there's really good time since fire data. DVCA provides a data set of fire polygons, which tell you roughly when that fire occurred and the fire type, whether or not it's a prescribed burn or a wildfire. But even within the fires that we see, like for example that last one, there's a lot of diversity. So we need to have within fire data to tell us about impact to forest canopy, and that's where the severity the severity of the last fire comes in. So really the main objective of this paper was to provide a fire severity prediction for each fire in the last 16 years. And that was about 717 fires, or a little bit more than 1 million hectares burnt. And that's from prescribed burns and wildfires. And essentially we're taking post-fire aerial images collected from NIRMET, and those are about 3 to 7 centimeter resolution with red, green, and blue bands. And then we're basically scaling that up to Landsat and taking the difference between Landsat images before and after that fire to provide this fire severity score. And I should note that the model that we've put together is very similar to what's happened on the East Coast in Victoria and New South Wales. And we actually use the same inputs and produce the same or similar categories with hopes to kind of marrying up these data sets in the future because they have the same units. For example, percent canopy scorch. And so really for each DVCA fire polygon, we want to gather all of our Landsat data before the fire, within 64 days of that fire, 64 days after that fire, and then provide this predicted fire severity score. It's a classification of 5 categories from unburnt to canopy burnt. And once the model is trained and validated, we only need 2 bits of information. That's the polygon, the geometry of where that fire occurred, and then the rough date or start and end dates of the fire to provide this classification. Here's the response variable, what we're actually trying to predict. And for each one is just really unburnt, and then 3 levels of canopy scorch up to canopy burnt. And you could argue a high severity fire would be anything greater than 80% canopy foliage scorched, or category 5, however you define it. But so for each fire, we're trying to assign each 30 by 30 meter pixel into one of these categories. Now, these are ideal to Luke Collins and Rebecca Gibson over in Victoria and New South Wales. And so within the Northern Jarrah Forest, we're working on just really strictly on open eucalypt forests and woodlands. And you can see that within the last 16 years, roughly everything has been burnt at least once by wildfire or prescribed burn. Split up between those two, it's about 80% prescribed burn and 20% wildfire. And then I've gone in, and for 64 different fires, I was able to find a post-fire aerial photo. And I was able to go in there and delineate Landsat pixels belonging to one of those 5 categories. And I did that for a little over 11,000 pixels between 2010 and 2020. And in that paper, which is in review now, we kind of validate across a range of conditions from topography and ruggedness, using Landsat 5 and 7 versus Landsat 7 and 8. Quite a few different things. And then we're training our model with 34 fires, with data from 34 of those fires, and then we're testing the model on 30 independent fires that the model has not seen. And those include prescribed burns across multiple seasons and wildfires. Data going into the model, we have 18 predictor variables sourced from 8 spectral indices. These are the same from the folks over east. We did that on purpose. So the magenta ones represent pre and post-fire relative changes between those pre and post Landsat images. And we have our pre-fire images and post-fire. And each one of these indices is sensitive to vegetation, soil moisture, charred material, quite a bit going on there. And our model accuracy, we kind of split it up by wildfire and then prescribed burn for each season. And so overall, the overall accuracy is about 83-84% across 5,700 pixels. And for wildfires, we're doing quite well because wildfires are mostly category 5 and some unburnt along the edges. So it's pretty easy to predict those category 5s. And just to give you an idea, this is a confusion matrix of our observed and predicted fire severity classes. So on the x-axis is our observed value, and on the y-axis is our predicted value. So, for example, in the first box on the top left, there were 273 accurately predicted category 1. And if we were getting them all correct, it would be a perfect diagonal line. But you can see that most of the error is occurring within one of neighboring classes. So predicting category 2 and 3 within wildfires was actually tricky because there's a lot going on there, and there are many different wildfires and types of different species and topography. And so detecting category 2 and 3 within wildfires is tricky, but delineating 1 from 4 and 5 here, not too bad. So that's just one example for the wildfires. And then between prescribed burns, we're getting that 80 to 84% accuracy. And we can kind of zoom into what some of the data look like. So here are 2 example fires. These are testing fires that we predict on, wildfire A and prescribed burn B. Wildfire A, which was majority high severity fire, mostly category 4 and category 5. But along the edge, we can detect these low severity patches that accurately contain patches of maybe burnt understory, but unburnt canopy. And then the inverse is true for these prescribed burns, where it's mostly category 2 and 3, for this fire B, but we can see these, what you call hotspots on that eastern edge of the prescribed burn, which accurately depict these really high severity crown scorching fires. And zoom in there even a little bit further and just note that we're doing pretty well at delineating these even class boundaries within those fires. And so in the process now of merging these 2 data sets together, so the fire severity data, we're planning to make all of that freely available. So all of the 717 fires that we predict on will be, right now they're in a nice Google Earth Engine web app that we can share, as well as making the data freely accessible to download. And then also taking our flowering model and scaling that up across several sites and covering many different conditions of time since fire and severity of fire, as well as controlling for rainfall zones and topography, to ask some interesting questions about the drivers of forest phenology in the Southwest. And so I want to say thanks to Nick, Sam, John, and Natasha, as well as the CRC, and thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. I've posted it online if anybody's got any questions. But does anybody in the room have any questions for our two speakers? Of course, Roberto.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for your presentations. I have many questions. I will forget most of them, but a couple of questions first. One is probably for Bryan first. You talked about the Sentinel-1A SAR. I just don't understand. I know that we have many more satellites as well, and this one can see through the clouds. Can we use the other ones as well to see through the clouds? Why do we lose resolution if we use one or the other? Why do we have many different?
So there's, I guess the main split in terms of the sensing capabilities is optical versus radar. And so the optical satellites are seeing, what you're seeing with your eyes, basically. And so if I've got cloud or something obscuring the satellite, what the satellite is seeing, then that impacts my ability to examine and identify and measure what's happening on the surface of the Earth. But radar then allows us to kind of see through the clouds. And there are other radar-based satellites out there. We just happen to use this one for this because it had the best coverage for our area. And yeah, the way that we're examining the information is based on backscatter. So when a pixel is flooded and it's flat, then you don't get much return off of it. But when you've got a lot of topographic relief or a lot of surface structure, then you'll get more return, you'll get more scatter. And so we can identify what that threshold is really between a flat pixel and a not so flat pixel. So that's kind of how that analysis is done. But there are other radar packages out there. We just happen to use that one because we have the coverage. But that's kind of the difference between radar versus optical remote sensing.
Anybody else got any questions? Caitlin.
Thanks both of you for really interesting talks. My questions would depend. I was curious, I think you presented some really cool work, and I'm curious about the greenness index in particular and how you go with, I guess, masking out fruits in a lot of eucalypt species when the leaves are, flushy new. They quite often contain a lot of red pigments in the leaves, and so how does that factor into when you're detecting these greenness peak thresholds in the remote sensing?
Well, I haven't actually observed that from the data on the ground. I've seen that, and we built into the model actually a recovery period. So in doing so, we assume that if that pixel flowered on that year, it would decrease just for a few weeks, and then would actually respond in greenness. Whereas I think in these leaf flushing events, it would maybe drop and then stay down at least for a few months. So we built a few mechanisms in the model to account for things like this. And so we can see, I see lots of different time series of trees doing different things from the satellite, but I also don't know what's actually happening on the ground because we're limited in the area that we can collect our data in. So maybe modeling some of this stuff in the future, there's good potential for it because the canopy does change a lot over the course of the year and from year to year, but it almost seems, or at least I don't know what's causing most of it. And we're also limited in the temporal resolution of the data. So the PlanetScope data, we're limited in the number of images we can access. So I only get images during the flowering period. And I don't know if leaf flushing happens during the summer, but really we're only looking from January to March for these drops in greenness. So we also
might be happening a bit earlier in the spring green up.
Could, yeah.
curious because we've got a bunch of phenocams that are coming online across the TERN network in Australia. And so there could be some interesting synergies there because we will have daily images of canopy cover and a bunch of different eucalypt forests around Australia. And so some of the work, I'm just sort of, piecing together, how your work could apply to other fields in understanding canopy flushing events versus flowering events and linking up with those sort of on-site measurements of phenology. So yeah, it's interesting. It's good to hear that there are contingencies built into the model to account for that and potential for future work. So.
And the same thing for fire. If fire, for example, goes through, you see a huge decrease in greenness, but you wouldn't expect to see that increase for, several months. Yeah, thanks.
Let's go to Michael first. Let's share the love.
Bryan, the Cambodian farmers, presumably you've been living with uncertainty historically, and presumably had ways of adapting to that and managing that. Is there any evidence that those processes are sort of holding up under the new uncertainty regimes, as in that they're just ability to deal with uncertainty, they've managed to deal with this uncertainty, or is it too big a shock?
Look, I think they've been living and adapting to uncertainty for an extended period of time, and it seems like that they're always trying new approaches, new adaptation approaches, and some work better than others. So one of the things that they've been doing is they've been digging out large areas to hold water after the flood event is gone, as an example. And so that works to a certain extent until it gets really dry, and then all your water evaporates, and so that doesn't work any longer. So I guess I'll think that it really kind of depends on, they keep implementing new approaches, and some have staying power and some don't. The other alternative is heading across the river and going and getting a job in a shop. Yeah, so it's 6 to 1 half does the other, I guess. But I think what is really important though is communicating to people outside of these regions that the environmental markers that are used or have been used to control decisions around livelihoods are changing, and so you can't rely on those anymore, and that drives adaptation processes. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
Are we doing any work here or within Australia? Do we know to share that knowledge across those more remote communities? Because I know of work that would be done across, our closer neighbours and even our closer cultures in the Torres Strait and Tonga and things like that.
look, I'm sure there is.
Yeah.
I'm not involved.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we really wanted to do was to, and we did this to a certain extent, but bring some of the people that we've been working with in Cambodia to Fiji and vice versa. But with visas and things, it becomes a little bit difficult to do so.
Yeah. There is cultural relevance between the two in terms of their practices.
Well, no, there's not. Well, I mean, I guess there are, but just facilitating that conversation and getting people talking about what their lived experience is in their specific location and how they've learned to adapt and overcome these issues, and being able to share that knowledge with traditional communities and different locations. Mm-hmm. I think it would have been fascinating if we could pull it off.
Really?
Possibly not, you did, but mentioning like how they were digging out waterfront tunnels, or at least maybe in the participatory mapping on each of these sides, was there an increase then in them talking about an increase in like waterborne diseases, like malaria or things like that, with those adaptation methods, or?
And not with those particular adaptation methods, but there was discussion around waterborne diseases, but it more from a seasonal standpoint, that these certain times of year, because of the seasonal flooding, you see an increase in those types of health outcomes.